So while I wait for people to kind of come up to the microphone, maybe I'll start off a question that I think is at the core of what MIDAS is trying to accomplish, which is each one of you described a lot of multidisciplinary collaborations. And so I'm curious, particularly, and we can start off maybe even just with you, Todd, like how did you pick like sleep apnea? How do you pick, like, of all the things that you can study, right? So how does this happen when we try to bring in the domain experts, with the informatics experts, with the methods experts, with even like the engineering experts, and just how the process goes along? Because like I said, I think that's at the core of what MIDAS is trying to accomplish.
Well, I'd be lying to you if I told you that I had a systematic way of how I did this. Part of it is serendipity and just meeting people. One thing I like to do is I like to go to events where I'm surrounded by people who have interesting problems. I guess, there's a saying that many engineers like to have solutions and then they go and they look for problems. We try to, it's harder to do, but we try to really walk around and bounce around people who really have problems and then to come through and help them generate solutions. So part of our time is that whenever there are events that have clinicians and whatnot that are talking about their challenges, we like to go over there and engage those and have conversations. So a lot of the collaborations that took place were really kind of just random things like that. In addition, once in a while, I guess I don't like to work on a problem unless I think there's a big potential for impact. So that's, of all the different things to potentially work on, we like to focus on things where we think the value add that we provide is substantial and also the potential benefit is large. But throwing darts and surrounding ourselves with people who have problems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is one strategy is to get involved in like a large consortia, and to those generally have involve interdisciplinary group of people and try to solve big problems. For example, for both TopMed and GSP, it involves a range of people from quantitative scientists and to the disease specialists. And so when we really get to work on those real problems and we can identify what are the important quantitative problems, and then we can incorporate the domain knowledge in the development of the computational and the statistical methodology. So I think working closely with the biologists and the clinician epidemiologists is critical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm a biostatistician, and what's unique about Vanderbilt, it's not actually completely unique, but it's almost unique, and that is that we're in the medical school, or we're in the medical center, as opposed to, I grew up in schools of public health, where the biostatistics department was in the School of Public Health. So it's a slightly different, we're within the medical center, and so it's sort of easy to collaborate with people in the medical center at Vanderbilt, because the chair of our department has really integrated us and has kind of pushed us to be in the center of all the research that's being done at Vanderbilt. It's also very beneficial to be in a place where there are a lot of people doing a lot of good research. I've just sort of taken advantage of that, and over time, when I first got to Vanderbilt, I had a few projects that didn't go so well, but then you end up, you find the people that you like to work with who are doing good research, and you guys stick together because you're productive together. So I've developed really good collaborations with people who work on the projects that I've discussed today.
Yeah, wonderful. I can follow up with this with the question then also, like, so once you find these problems, one of the other challenges that, and again, this is just very close to home for what we're going through right now, is trying to, in academia, oftentimes, it's almost to the point of being a cliche, the silos that exist, the credits that exist, right? At the medical school, there's different types of promotional tracks, different types of rewards, engineering school is completely different. How, like so if you pick a problem, and I love what you said, there's actually a good friend of mine, Victor Montori, he's talked about, like, we got to get rid of the idea of big data, we got to talk about big science, right? Big problems with big teams. But it's just, the system just doesn't seem to be, you know, set up in that way. And have you guys culturally tried to come across that? Like, just even like, you know, it's interesting, like, you know, we have discussions about how to frame papers, right? Most of the work that you guys present, I'm kind of curious, Jonathan, I mean, they don't make it into the clinical literature, to be honest, right? I mean, they oftentimes make it into either the biostatistical literature, engineering literature. Once in a while, there's like the science paper, but that crossover and that crosstalk doesn't seem to happen. It's something that keeps being an impediment for the true implementation of like all this wonderful work in a clinical setting that affects a patient's life.
Right. Well, one of the things that I established with my clinical collaborators is to make it very clear that there are things that we can do that benefit their community. And so for example, if we start with new methods, we can maybe publish an engineering journal, but then subsequently when we really test this in a clinical population, that first work maybe we're the corresponding authors on, but then subsequently we want our clinical collaborators to be the corresponding authors to publish, let's say in gastroenterology, the top journal in the GI field for the physicians. And so we try to establish that relationship very early on so that indeed everyone can get the credit as deserved. And in many situations, provided that personalities align, they seem to work out fine. Some collaborations we did have to stop because the personalities, you know, sometimes clinicians look at engineers as your technician, so to speak. But you know, usually you can pick up on that pretty fast, and you see that this is not going to be a symbiotic relationship. But in other situations, you really feed off of, you know, one another, and it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, you use symbiotic in your title.
There we go.
So.
Yeah. So yeah, those are great points. I would like to make 2 points. The first point is it's important for quantitative scientists to publish not only in quantitative science journal, but also in domain science journals. And this is particularly important in the field of data science right now for the quantitative scientists to impact the practice of medicine, public health, or biology, or broader field, and we need to have the method and be well known and in the domain science field. So for example, like in the old days, I probably published 75% of my paper in statistical journal and 25 in health science journal. But nowadays, I probably publish 50% of the papers in statistical journal, another 50% and in genetic journal. And a good number of my method paper are published in genetic journal. And the reason is the people who use those methods are more likely to read the genetic journals instead of the statistical journal. It's just a reality. And so I think that's important for the quantitative scientists to publish in domain science journal, including the method development. And the second thing, I think that's how to create an intellectually stimulating platform and for people with a different background to really interact. I think this is something like Meta can really help and try to really bring people. Just think about even just a workshop or conference. And the traditional way is we have a statistical conference talking about statistical method, for example, in longitudinal analysis or in causal inference. But it will be good that we can put up the workshop, focus on what's the big problem we want to solve, and bring the scientists, the domain scientists, computer scientists, and the statistician, informatician together, and then talk about how can we solve these big problems. And then this can really have this cross-interdisciplinary talking. And I think at lots of time, I feel I learned a lot from those talks. And even though I don't know the domain science well enough, but really this kind of cross-discipline talk really stimulated lots of good ideas.
Yeah, I'm sort of adding on to that. Like I've found that, you know, all of the projects that we work on now are necessarily the ones that are, you know, are successful at getting funding are often multidisciplinary now. That's just sort of an expectation. I agree. I also agree. Like, if you want to get your paper cited, you don't put it in a statistical journal because a lot of, you know, people aren't reading statistical journals, and so, you know, it's sort of like it's a certain kind of translational research. If you want, you know, if you want people to actually learn what you're talking about, then you have to put it in domain-specific journals. in order for it to get read and actually to get implemented. I have several of my collaborations, you know, like I get into these projects and I'm supposed to be the sort of the statistician who's involved in the project, but you know, you end up finding that there are really interesting methodological problems, and you end up saying, you know what, that's an interesting problem, I'm gonna learn about that and I'm gonna write something about that. And so that's happened on several projects for me where I've sort of work with somebody. There's so many interesting problems to work on methodologically, and then you identify that cool methodological problem, and then you write a paper about it, and somebody else can learn from it. So I've had that experience multiple times with people. Yeah, go ahead.
I was reflecting as she was talking, your original question. One other thing that happened at UC San Diego, which is a similar type of theme that you mentioned, engineers and clinicians didn't work together that much, is they created about 3 years ago a program called GEM. It's called Galvanizing Engineering and Medicine. And what happens is they got the campus to put some money aside. You know, money talks. And it started off with clinicians identifying problems that they think they don't know how to solve, and maybe an engineer can. And then, so they post a list of problems, and then engineers can respond to those, and they build teams, and they write joint proposals, and then a committee evaluates, and the top proposals they fund. And that's one way to try to get people to start to work together. And the second theme that I was going to say is one of the things I've also found is that if you can identify an application that can not only sort of transform science and maybe get published in a clinical journal, but if you can impact the practice of care so that the hospital can save money, then you're really going to catch the attention of the clinician. Because when it's all said and done, they need the RVUs, they need to bill, and if you can develop a framework that can actually help them save money and to be more effective, et cetera. And so we're increasingly thinking along those lines and understanding the payer aspect, what all the bottlenecks are in the decision tree, and how what we're doing can impact that. And that, we found, has caught the attention of quite a few people in the medical school as well.
Well, sometimes it's interesting, like in restating our problems to our engineering colleagues, we start to kind of actually see it kind of fresh for the first time again. So, Brian?
Well, yeah, you know, it's funny, I came up here to ask one question, then you more or less answered it. I want to know first what the difference was between 10 years ago and now, you know, in terms of, you know, doing this kind of work. And then, you know, on top of that, then, you know, Todd started to answer, when you guys started to answer that one, I was saying, well, gee, the answer sounds like it's interdisciplinary teams. And then the next question is, what do we do to enhance building the interdisciplinary teams? And Todd started to answer that. But still, I think it's good to think about, you know, what can we do, you know, as leaders to kind of promote this kind of data science, and what do you see are the impediments? You know, what are the impediments that we have to remove to get this to really go?
Well, I already alluded to how sometimes the clinicians look at engineers as just the technicians, and so some of that is a personality trait, but increasingly, so like the gentleman on the sleep apnea, he got his bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. So he already appreciates engineers because he's an engineer himself. And so we're noticing more engineers are going on into medicine, and you know, as that happens, I think that'll help. So I think part of it is personality. Similarly, some engineers are interested in just their pure stuff. They're not willing to take that risk, and so I think there's a bit of a selection bias where there's a subset of people who are really willing to do that. To what extent can we change that? I don't know, because personalities are personalities. But at the institutional level, I think what I mentioned about the university putting money aside to see these people you know, genuinely trying to work together. If you guys can encourage the leadership at U of M to try to do things like that. That's the starting point, I would say.
Yeah.
I think there are at least I've experienced, and it's a challenge for me, is that some people want to hear the answer that they want to hear, and they're not so excited to hear something that they don't want to hear that isn't good news. And so that's been a little bit of a challenge for me as a statistician, is sometimes having to be that person who tells you that what you're doing is wrong or what you can't do. And that's not, delivering that information is not easy and sometimes not appreciated. And that can hurt relationships, honestly. And you know, people do like to people do like it when people say, yeah, oh yeah, we can do that. You know, we can totally answer that question. And so I think that that's people appreciating critical feedback would help in collaborations, at least that I'm involved in.
Yeah,
John?
so the other thing I would like to, those are great points. The other thing I would like to add is how to share credit. I think that is, for example, authorship. And so this become more and more important and in the health science field. And so generally we know that the first author and last authors are most important one, but when we deal with an interdisciplinary team and how the team can really develop a mechanism that the credit can be fairly shared, that will promote the more productive interdisciplinary research.
Yeah, thanks. That's very thoughtful and true. Yeah, you have a question?
My question is for you, Professor Brahmajee. It looks like healthcare is getting to be more interdisciplinary than we used to think about going to the physician's office. So is there any thought of incorporating some of these ideas earlier on in the medical education, like in medical schools, before they become clinicians and too siloed, and maybe engineers become too siloed?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Actually, it was gonna, something that was coming up as all this discussion was happening is that, again, we found in some ways maybe we're too old to change, right? And our trainees, though, are incredibly adaptive to these ideas. And, it's also a bandwidth problem too, right? I mean, like when you get to a certain point, there's only so many problems you can handle, and you almost feel like you're carrying the same hammer and you're just looking for that nail. But like our trainees are just so excited about these methods. They're so excited about these techniques. And the best thing about it is then they work with your trainees, right? And there's a lot of energy, and then we get to take all the credit. And so the world goes on. But it's really, I think what you're saying is critical. Like even here, we've started like a kind of like a health, like a health fair around like machine learning and data science. We had a recent exhibition. We're trying to partner together medical students who are in this space with like students at the College of Engineering. And I think those kinds of things are really exciting because of the energy. The one thing that I do think that's critical for like senior leadership though is rather than just kind of have it be like a one-off abstract or maybe even a small paper, is to kind of give the energy and vision about the big problems, because that I do think takes expertise and some context around it. So.
Todd mentioned N-of-1 data science, and I was wondering if there might be good prospects for building precision medicine from essentially N-of-1 from multivariate time series before aggregating with statistics, as distinct from working from statistics and group averages down to
That's a
individuals.
great question.
Yeah, and I think with the advent of things such as wearables and whatnot, we can increasingly do that. And what I like about it as an applied mathematician is that it creates unique challenges and how to carefully model this, and to make sure not only do you have a good model, but it satisfies a goodness of fit criterion after you perform model fitting. And so that's an active area of research, and I think that's very much going to continue. In fact, there's some of the people from the quantified self community you might have heard of. These are kind of the people who kind of nerd out with all the different devices. Well, they've created a new journal specifically tailored to N=1 data analysis for longitudinal time series analysis from wearables and other aspects. And so I think there's huge potential to, if we can understand how to quantify variability and to carefully understand this, there's huge opportunities to have much more precise ways of intervening. And that's kind of what I wanted to give a glimpse of in that slide that I showed. But it's an active area of research, and I think it has the potential of being very actionable.
The narcissome. I heard that language like recently.
Yeah, and so the other related matter is to do the precision medicine, one really need to think about integrating different type of data. And so, for example, like the genetics data and environmental exposure data, and also the clinical data. And then, then how can one identify? So basically, think about this as a problem. You think about like you do go to Amazon, you buy a book of like SAT, and then Amazon will know like you have a teenager in the house. Then they will so suppose you buy, then they will recommend you buy SAT subject and math or chemistry, right? So they try to find people similar to you, right? You think about precision medicine. You find out people similar to you and to see and what kind of treatment they have, then those information can help predict your treatment.
Well, that's great. Well, I wanted to kind of just end there and thank the speakers for a really great session. And yes.
Inner factors plays out entirely within the confines of everything that encapsulates it. So, for example, everything within a platform's terms of service, everything that a platform's terms of service forbids is nevertheless possible.